Uh, well, thank you for that wonderfully eloquent introduction, and I will try to live up to it. It seems difficult. One of my favorite moments in modern literature is a scene from the American novelist and Nobel laureate Saul Bellows' novel, The Dean's December. In this novel, an American academic, Dean Albert Cord of the University of Chicago, at one point visits Romania. His wife is Romanian, and they visit one winter on family business. And this is, of course, Romania long before the fall of communism, Ceausescu's Romania, an alarming country, wretched, restricted, and bleak. And there's a moment in the novel when Cord is standing at the window of his wife's family's apartment, looking out at a frost-whitened park, and he hears a dog in the distance beginning to bark. And the dog barks on and on and on. And because this is a dog in a Saul Bellows novel, it is necessary for the dean to speculate on what the dog is talking about. And he decides that the interminable barking is the dog's protest against the limitations of dog experience. You know? And that what the dog is trying to say in its agony is, for God's sake, open the universe a little more. Open the universe a little more. I remember when I first read that sentence, I immediately thought, that is as good a description of the purpose and nature of art as I've ever read. This is what all artists, verbal, visual, musical, dramatic, cinematic, strive to do, and the degree to which they succeed depends upon their individual talents. The great artist can make the universe feel greatly enlarged. The lesser artist must settle for less. The bad artist fails in the attempt, but all art wants to push against boundaries, to increase by some small amount the sum total of what it's possible to imagine, to think, to know, to feel, and therefore finally to become and to be. The point is that you cannot push against boundaries by remaining in the safe middle ground. You actually have to go to the frontier and shove. And of course, there is a place for the safe middle ground. There is a place for popular forms of all kinds, for books and movies and shows that seek only to entertain. All of us, myself included, sometimes ask for nothing more than entertainment, an exciting film, a foot-tapping tune. None of us wishes to eat haute cuisine every day. Sometimes a snack or a bite of junk food is what hits the spot. But true art tries to go to some sort of an edge, linguistic, technical, thematic, even moral. And boundary pushing inevitably involves a certain element of risk, because at the frontier there are always frontier guards, many of them self-appointed, who do not want boundaries to be pushed back, who would in fact greatly prefer it if the sum total of what it is possible to say and think and be was to be reduced. Forces that favor a narrowing rather than a broadening of the discourse. These are often powerful forces, and they push back against the artist's effort, often with distressing consequences for the artist. Art itself is often more durable than artists. The poet Mandelstam was killed by Stalin, but the poetry of Mandelstam survives. The poet Ovid's life was ruined when the Emperor Augustus exiled him to the Black Sea, but the poetry of Ovid survives. The poet Lorca was murdered by the thugs of Franco's Phalange, but the poetry of Lorca also survives. And in fact, as such cases demonstrate, the art persecuted at one moment in history often lives on to define that very moment in the eyes of future generations. The Impressionist painters were mocked at first. The term Impressionism itself was coined to satirize them as painters who could not paint properly, but only give an unfinished impression of their subject. Wallpaper in its embryonic state is more finished, wrote one critic in 1874. Less than 100 years later, the Impressionists are at the heart of the artistic establishment, at the very center of European culture, their paintings forming the cornerstones of most of the great museum collections around the world. As Paul Simon once sang, one man's ceiling is another man's floor. What one age condemns, the next rejoices in. Myself, I have taken inspiration all my life from the liberal and open-minded culture into which I was born, the infinitely plural and endlessly stimulating world of post-independence India. My family played a large part in shaping my way of thinking. My father's people lived for several generations in the famous Old Delhi Mohalla of Ballimara, the Ballimara of Mirza Ghalib, and my father grew up with poetry filling his head. My family's name was not Rushdie then. My paternal grandfather was named Khwaja Muhammad Din Khaliqi Dehlvi, and Rushdie was a name my father chose, made it up, to simplify matters, picked because of his admiration for the Andalusian Muslim philosopher Ibn Rushd, Averroes to the west, the author of the celebrated Tahaffut, the incoherence of the incoherence, his spirited reply to Ghazali's Incoherence of the Philosophers, in which he, Ibn Rushd, defended human thought, philosophy, against the hardline argument advanced by Ghazali that much philosophy, such as the thought of Aristotle and Ibn Sina, was contrary to Islam. My father greatly admired Ibn Rushd's arguments against Islamic literalism and in favor of interpretation, of openness, which are the brilliant precursors of an argument that continues right up to today. Good name to choose. In other words, I was born into a house of argument and debate, raised in the belief that open disagreement is the best guarantee of an open society. I have said before, and I'll say it again, that freedom of thought is not a tea party. It's not a place where people sit about politely and make gentle, inoffensive, tedious chit-chat. True intellectual freedom, from which artistic freedom derives, is a rough and tumble thing, and strongly argued disagreement is its hallmark, not meek agreement or acquiescence. A free society is one which creates an arena for such discourse, and then fiercely protects the rights of all disputants to make their case, all disagreements to be voiced, all inspirations and challenges to be expressed, faced, and learned from, perhaps rejected, perhaps not. My mother's father, Dr. Ataullah Bhatt, taught me the same lesson from a different end of the religious spectrum. Unlike my father, my maternal grandfather was a devout man who said his prayers 5 times a day throughout his life and made the pilgrimage to Makkah. He was also a man of infinite sweetness, tolerance, and patience, who taught his brood of grandchildren that there were to be no limits in his presence on what could and could not be discussed. "Baba Jan, I've decided I don't believe in God," a serious little boy could say to him. And he would reply, "Is that so? Come and sit down here beside me and explain how you arrived at such a foolish conclusion." His tone might be gruff, but his eyes were twinkling. It was always openness with Dr. Bhatt. And we learned from that twinkle in his eyes that it was all right to push and test and try to open the universe a little more, even before we knew how. This was a modern Muslim family then, but an Indian family even more than that. As some of you may know, I was born in the city of Bombay 8 weeks to the day before Independence Day. This is because my parents, feeling to be straightforward more Indian than Muslim, did not opt for Pakistan, as the phrase went. In Bombay, we led the opposite of a narrowly communal life. Of my father's 2 closest friends, one was a Hindu and the other a Jew. Among my own boyhood friends were members of all the religions and no religion, northern boys and boys from the south, boys whose mother tongues ranged from Urdu to English, Tamil to Gujarati, Marathi to Malayalam. This was and is Bombay. Bombay, Mumbai, Bombay. It was never the narrow preserve of any language or any one way of being an Indian. Like any great metropolis, it drew everyone towards it, and all those who came were merged into its Bombayness and together defined what that quality was. All great cities are open cities. To try to wall them off is to kill what makes them great. My life has taken me to many countries and many cultures, but I have always tried and known and tried to demonstrate in my work that this idea of cultural openness, which I'm here to commend to you, and which has been of such importance to me, is an idea given to me in India by Indians, an idea with old Indian roots valued in every Indian tradition. This is not an alien idea being foisted on India by outsiders. It is our heritage as Indians, integral to our own culture, and we must preserve it or lose some essential part of ourselves. This culture, Indian culture, defined very broadly, has perhaps never been so widely celebrated beyond these shores as it is today. It seems that wherever one looks, one finds some aspect of Indian culture being displayed and enjoyed. I've just arrived here from Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, where the university's renowned Carlos Museum is mounting a major show of antique Indian jewelry. Western fashion designers are turning increasingly towards India for its traditions, its sense of color, the craft skills of its workers. The musical genius of A.R. Rahman is suddenly as much in demand in Hollywood as here at home. Indian actors, Anil Kapoor, even Aishwarya Rai, have begun to, sorry. No. Sorry, Aishwarya. Have begun to establish themselves beyond the perimeter of Bollywood. It has become commonplace to find new Indian movies playing in the giant multiplexes near Times Square in New York. Three Idiots can be seen right now on 42nd Street. To speak briefly about Indian literature, it has always been and remains a point of great personal pride for me to have been a part of the great flood of Indian writers who have made such a mark on world literature in the last 30-odd years. A development that can perhaps only be compared to the celebrated boom in Latin American literature in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Speaking for myself, the warmth of the reception given to Midnight's Children here and subsequent books has meant more to me than all the Booker Prizes in the world. Looking beyond my own work, it has been wonderful to see the flair, courage, and variety with which Indian novelists, from Arundhati Roy to Arvind Adiga, from Vikram Seth to Vikram Chandra, from Amitav Ghosh to Amit Chaudhary, from Rana Dasgupta to Altaf Tayarwala, have brought their narratives into the mainstream of the universal story that is literature, and to see that narrative decisively altered by these many Indian interventions. These past years, too, have seen the Indian visual arts flourishing in the international art market. Right now, contemporary Indian art, along with contemporary Chinese art, is, to use the unattractive parlance of the market, hot. But the achievement is much greater than merely financial. Indian artists are carving out a modern visual vernacular that is their own, neither blatantly derivative of the West nor overly dependent on India's own artistic heritage. In the work of Bhupen Khakar, Arpita Singh, Krishan Khanna, Navjot Altaf, Pushpa Mala, many others, Indian artists have created and are creating a modern oeuvre of immense originality and power. In the work of these artists, as in that of the ultra-contemporary Subodh Gupta and that of the earlier generation of Raza, Souza, Gaitonde, and of course, Maqbool Fida Hussain, all Indians meet and meld. Eastern and Western traditions engage in intricate dialogue, and in the crossing and recrossing of frontiers, which lies at the heart of an open society, the new is exhilaratingly born. As India itself rises to the forefront of the international scene, this parallel rise of Indian culture should be a matter of pride to all Indians. However, my mention of Mr. Hussain inescapably leads me to some sadder and darker reflections. Can it be that India, at this high moment in its history, is forgetting its own narrative of openness and beginning to bring down the shutters? Can it be that those who would close the universe are gaining the ascendancy over those who would open it? Let me just be clear about this. The exile of M.F. Hussain, his fears for his safety in his beloved homeland, the scurrilous cases brought against him, the weakness of the government response, and his decision to accept Qatari citizenship and cease to be an Indian national. These things are shameful, and Hussein's plight is a disgrace. That Hussain will now seek to house his own personal collection abroad, so that masterworks which are a part of this country's artistic story will be lost to India. That is another aspect of the tragedy. Ugliest of all is the language being used against Hussain, which one can find today all over the internet in comments attached to newspaper reportage, and too often in press reportage and commentary as well. This is language so distasteful that I do not want to quote it verbatim. A grand old man is jeered at for being old. A man painting from the depths of his spirit is accused of immoral pornography. An artist who has given decades of his life to the imagination is dismissed as worthless. His self-imposed exile is called cowardice, and to his change of nationality, many people say, good riddance. These voices do not emanate from the India I love, but from another emerging, openly Philistine, proudly communalist India, whose growing volubility is immensely disturbing. It is deeply distressing to find so much volcanic hatred bubbling so near to the surface of everyday life. If there's anything to add to this much debated issue, I think it may be this, that as in the case of the Danish cartoons, although Hussein's work far outranks those scribbles, we should understand that there are two separate issues here. The first issue may be expressed thus. What do we think of Hussein's paintings of Hindu goddesses? Do we like them or dislike them? Are we given aesthetic pleasure by them or deep offense? And even, should they be publicly exhibited or not? To these questions, there plainly are many different answers. It is plain that the work is disliked as well as liked, that it gives offense as well as pleasure, and it is perfectly proper that people voice these responses, whatever they may be. This is the risk of art. You offer the products of your imagination to the public scrutiny, and the public will respond as it will. If the response is divided or hostile, so be it. That is sometimes the price of doing the work. Even on the last question, should the work be exhibited, which in the case of the Danish cartoons, for example, was the question of whether the cartoons should be published, there will inevitably be strong feelings on both sides, yes and no. I return to my earlier point about the nature of freedom. Freedom is an argument, and sometimes you lose the argument. There can be no objection to people expressing vehement feelings on this issue, though there can and should be an objection to the ugliness of their language. I would go so far as to say that it is one of the functions of art, by no means the only one, but one nevertheless, to provoke in a society the arguments by which that society comes to understand itself better, and by which perhaps it progresses. The Hussein case suggests less optimistically that such arguments can also lead to regression, to a society deciding to be less than it was before. The point about this first issue, the issue of strongly divided opinion, is that it does not need to be resolved. Newspaper picture editors make decisions every day about what is worth publishing, and no two editors would make the same decision. Some would have published none of the cartoons in Denmark, others only a few of them, others would have chosen to publish them all. Similarly, there will be those who wish that Hussein had displayed some of his goddess paintings, others who accept a few of the images while rejecting others, and others still who respond positively to them all. In short, people will think what they think. They will feel what they feel, they will respond as they wish to respond, and that is all proper and legitimate behavior in any free society. It is the second issue that needs to be addressed seriously. The second issue is that of violence, of actual violence or the threat of it, and of violence's ugly sisters, harassment and persecution. And on this subject, there really are not, or there should not be, two sides to the question. When violence is threatened, it must be resisted. When there is an attempt to impose one contentious point of view on society by the use of menaces or actual force, that attempt must be rebuffed with absolute conviction and resolve. To appease violence only ensures that violence will be used more frequently in the future. To surrender to the threat of violence is to damage one's own moral fiber. It is cowardice. In the face of violent threats regarding the Danish cartoons, the correct response would be to publish those cartoons in every newspaper in the world. Not to insult Islam, but to demonstrate that violence is counterproductive and that when we are threatened, we are not afraid. That we can stand our ground against the men of violence and force them to retreat. To surrender to violence and to blame its victim as if he were the perpetrator is the worst thing of all, morally indefensible and shockingly unjust. Yet that is what is happening in the case of M.F. Hussein. There are, of course, voices raised against this. In a recent editorial, the Deccan Herald spoke of the rising tide of intolerance in this country and the inability to judge art on its own terms, the increasing communalization of art, politics, and society is a dangerous trend, the newspaper said, and the government's responsibility should go beyond stating that Hussein is welcome in India to ensuring that he and his art will be safe in this country. That responsibility extends to the entire society too. That responsibility extends to the entire society too. That is well said, and I want to return to that point. I would like to add my own voice to these demands for government action. In the face of violence and threats of violence, India should insist on displaying Hussein's paintings. Again, not to offend anyone, but to demonstrate India's commitment to liberty of expression. And it should proudly guarantee the artist's safety to publicly demonstrate that in the land of Mahatma Gandhi, violence will never become the dominant discourse. This is not what has happened so far. That is a thing profoundly to regret. But it can still happen, and it should. Even more regrettably, the assault on Hussein is by no means an isolated instance. Salil Tripathi, writing in Mint, mentions the protests in Andhra Pradesh recently against Yarlagadda Lakshmi Prasad, who was honored for his Telugu novel Draupadi. Barbers, Tripathi continues, force Shah Rukh Khan to change the name of a film. The Shiv Sena takes on Sachin Tendulkar and Mukesh Ambani, who say but Mumbai belongs to all Indians. And the paper tigers in Mumbai threaten to disrupt Shah Rukh Khan's new film, My Name is Khan. To these examples, one could add the bizarre Indian opposition to a proposed film starring Kate Blanchett as Edwina Mountbatten, a film that intended to deal with the well-known deep relationship between that lady and Jawaharlal Nehru. Even such historical speculation is now deemed offensive to Indian sensitivities. There is also, of course, the sad case of Taslima Nasreen, whose Indian visa will apparently not be renewed, and a few years ago, the appalling attack on the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute in Pune, merely because the historian James Lane had done research there while writing a biography of Shivaji, to which the Sambhaji Brigade, the militant youth wing of the Maharashtra Seva Sangh, objected. The Lane biography was, of course, immediately banned and remains banned to this day. Can it really be that Indians believe that Lane and BORI were blameworthy for the Sambhaji Brigade's attack? That Sachin Tendulkar and Mukesh Ambani are to blame for stating the obvious truth that all India is free for all Indians? That Shah Rukh Khan is to blame for speaking in favor of Pakistani cricketers participating in the IPL? I'm sorry to say that it's beginning to look as if these blatant inversions of the truth may be thought of as the truth by a large, if unquantifiable, proportion of today's Indians. And here I come to my point about the wider responsibility of the citizenry as a whole. It should be said that the growth of a culture of complaint, as the Australian critic Robert Hughes has called it, is not by any means unique to India. It sometimes seems in Britain, in America, and everywhere that various groups, not just religious groups, but racial and sexual groups as well, have begun to define themselves by the things that offend them most, which is to say, to define themselves negatively by what they are against, rather than positively and creatively by what they are for. If nothing much offends you these days, then, well, who are you? We're in danger of thinking of our rage as the characteristic that expresses us best. Whereas in my opinion, the surrender to anger is always a weakness and one of the worst aspects of being human. At the heart of the anti-Hussein position is this culture of offendedness, which justifies itself according to the crude logic of Mosaic law, an eye for an eye, two wrongs make a right, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. And my own example, I regret to say, has been used as an argument. If my work is unacceptable because of its alleged affront to Muslim sensibilities, then Hussein is unacceptable because Hindu sensibilities matter just as much. I have two replies to this. The first is that I do not agree that the treatment of my work in India has been or is proper. Even if we speak only of tactics rather than ethics, most of those who protested against the Satanic Verses in 1988 and 89 have accepted that their protests were counterproductive and misguided. Even if we speak only of due process rather than ethics, India banned this book without even going through the motions of its own regulations on censorship. Even if we speak only of the contents of the work rather than ethics, Any reader of mine can find in my books Muslims drawn sympathetically as well as unsympathetically, also good and bad Hindus, Christians, and Jews. My intention was never to lampoon any one community, but to look at human life as clearly as I can. 22 years have passed since the furor over my book began in India, ignited, I'm sorry to say, by an article in India Today. And I hope people, including journalists in India Today, see more clearly now. The Indian ban on the satanic verses was and is wrong. It should not be used to justify the current hostility being shown to M.F. Hussain. The second argument is that of Mahatma Gandhi, an eye for an eye, and the whole world goes blind. It is highly desirable for the cycle of attack and counterattack to end. There is sadly no sign that this end is near. This week, one reads that the president of the Indian Center for Inquiry, Mr. Inaya Narisethi, and his colleagues Subbarao and Macha Laxmaya, alias Krantikar, have been arrested for publishing an anthology named Crescent Over the World that has brought some Muslim rallies onto the streets. I have myself a bone to pick with these gentlemen, as it happens, since it appears that they have published a text of mine without seeking my permission. To this date, I have no idea what text they have published, whether it has been accurately reproduced or falsified, and how it has been contextualized by the editors. This is shoddy behavior, and I deplore it. However, for the local police to give in to unruly protesters, seize copies of the book, and arrest its editors is even shoddier. Yet that is very often the state of affairs in India today. In matters of culture, the mob rules. Identity politics dominates the national discourse. On this question, identity politics, I am of the same mind as Amartya Sen. When we define our identities narrowly, as Hindus or Muslims, for example, we greatly increase the probability of discord. And in today's India, there is much impetus behind the move to force us into such narrow corners of self-definition. But all of us know that in reality, we all have plural identities. Any one of us may be, at any given moment, not only Hindu, but also a bald person, a father, a railway employee, a cricket fan, an asthmatic, a chess player, a movie lover. Identity is plural. We are all composite selves. The way we are with our children is not the way we are with our bosses. We are different again with our lovers and our friends. When we define our identities accurately in this multiple way, we immediately find things in common with other people. Boldness, parenthood, work, sport, illness, hobbies, pastimes. What we have in common is greater than what separates us. Yet we are in danger of forgetting this, of fencing ourselves into smaller and smaller enclaves and feeling threatened by everyone outside. When people retreat into these ever-diminishing fortresses of religion or region or language, dissension and hostility escalate at once. We saw this on a continental scale after the fall of the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall. It was as though Europeans, alarmed by their sudden freedom, created new, smaller iron curtains, new walls to hide behind. And at once conflict exploded, Serb against Croat and Bosnian, with bitter results. Now there is a real danger of such ideological enclosures imperiling what Sunil Khilnani called the idea of India. And as is so often the case, one of the primary battlegrounds chosen by the intolerant is the field of art and culture. We know the history of our age of the world. We know how often artists and intellectuals have taken the brunt of authoritarianism. We understand that the independent mind, the unfettered imagination, the uncensored vision of the artist, and yes, also the niggling and burrowing of the journalist, is feared by Chinese grandees and ayatollahs, by ideologues and barbarians. We have seen over and over in many countries how a writer, an artist, a film star is accused of what Orwell called thought crime, and at once the Stasi or the Securitate or the KGB or SAVAK come knocking at his door. In the Indian variation, however, we are not facing the authoritarianism of the state, for the state is weak, as we have seen, but a rising tide of authoritarianism among sections of the people. And once again, it is art and ideas that face the brunt of the attack. Why is it so easy to mobilize public opinion against artists? So easy for the accusation of their alleged provocations to become the point rather than the violent reaction to their work? A painting, after all, a painting is an object in a space. If you don't like the idea of it, you do not have to enter that space and look at it. The notion that it provokes merely by existing somewhere on Earth is irrational, yet it is an unreason many people see as reasonable. A book you don't like does not have to be purchased, nor does it have to be opened. This is, in fact, why we have books by different authors in our bookstores. Or if it is opened, it can be shut, at which point it presumably loses its ability to offend you. Yet, once again, the very existence of an unread book is seen as a sufficient provocation, causing injury and therefore becoming responsible for whatever injuries may subsequently be inflicted by the supposedly injured parties. The same, it seems, can be true of an unseen film or an unheard song. A part of the answer why it's so easy to mobilize this kind of hostility is, of course, that the arts are soft targets. They have no troops, and they are vulnerable. Paintings can be destroyed, books can be burned, libraries can be devastated, film theaters can be menaced. That is pretty obvious. A more difficult part of the answer, however, may be that in India, not only in India, but also in India, people suspect artists. They are thought of as some sort of self-justifying elite, which is an extraordinary misconception in the light of how difficult, provisional, often ill-paid, and unrecognized a life dedicated to the arts can be. Most writers, painters, musicians, and actors struggle. Even those who become well-known have usually paid their dues with long years of penury and hardship. The idea of the arts as a vocation, a calling, which is how artists themselves see their profession, as a vocation of the same order as medicine or monasticism, is not widely accepted by the general public. So it is easy to paint artists as careerists, sensationalists, amoral hedonists, pursuing the modern deities of celebrity and wealth, and carelessly blaspheming against the ancient deities as they do so. The arts have their followers, of course, and thank goodness for them, and those who love books, music, painting, and films well know what it takes to create such works: the discipline, the dedication, the honesty, the integrity, the humility, the talent. But for the larger section of the population that has neither the time nor the inclination for the arts, artists are not serious people. As my father said on the day I told him I wanted to be a writer, "What will I tell my friends?" He changed his mind some years later when his friends started calling him up to congratulate him. Writing, painting, acting, and so on are simply not thought of as proper jobs. Those who do them are easily depicted as egotistical layabouts, philanderers, and drunks. And to help the accusation along, there are a few artists who are all of those. And once they have been so depicted, their work can easily be dismissed. There is one common feature to the attacks on M.F. Hussain and whoever else falls foul of the communalists' rage. Their work is not taken seriously. Hussein's use of the nude is used to attack him, and he has painted, the only thing he's painted more often than nudes is horses. And the central role of the nude in the history of art is simply ignored or treated as alien and therefore wrong, as if art could be forced to obey narrowly nationalist definitions of what it can and cannot be. Nor are artists taken seriously as individuals. Their characters are denigrated, their motives questioned, as well as their work derided. No matter how distinguished their careers, how great their recognition, how important their oeuvre, they become, once they are targeted, not much better than scum. This is so much easier than actually engaging with what you don't understand or don't like. Treat its creators as worthless, the work as less than worthless, and that justifies the assault. Again, this is by no means unique to India. Communism routinely denigrated the writers it persecuted, and so did European fascism. But it is sad to see this country, the poetry-loving India in which I was raised, often adopting such extremist and brazenly anti-art attitudes. So, yes, the state is derelict in its duty of protection, but the people too must be asked to think again. to refuse the ugly simplicities of those who brand artists as their enemies. Art is not the enemy of the people. It is the work which for future generations will tell the story of what our time was like. The artist is the people's ambassador to the future. I am asking, in short, for a better understanding of what art is and a greater respect for the people who make it. And central to that understanding is the principle that art seeks to open the universe. And it does so according to the vision of each individual artist. And if it is not cherished, not given the space in which such visions can flower, then it will die, and with it will perish the collective imagination of the human race. It will inevitably be the case that individual works of art will step on the toes of this group or that group, will shock and challenge and offend some of us. That is the price an open society pays for its openness, and we must simply learn to deal with it, to turn away from what we dislike towards the things we love. If India goes down the road of communalized culture, it will, make no mistake, alienate many of those in the outside world who currently admire it. If this becomes a culture of intolerance, well, there are many such countries in the world. And were India to fall into that group, it would lose its unique standing in the international community. Let us not become another closed world, another China, another Iran, another Pakistan. Let our universe remain open, and let us strive to open it further. I just want to emphasize in closing that what I'm saying is not in the name of some alien, incompatible Western idea of liberty, but in the name of the ancient and astonishingly liberal and sophisticated culture which it is our privilege to share. In the Ibadat Khana of Fatehpur Sikri, the Emperor Akbar's celebrated house of debate, in which many ideas of the world, conservative and innovative, Muslim and non-Muslim, could confront one another, there is a better model for Indian Islam than the narrow sectarianism of some modern imams. I was recently listening to my friend, the filmmaker Deepa Mehta, speak of how deeply her filmmaking is inspired by the principles embodied in the Natya Shastra. And I was reminded of the story near the beginning of that great work, when the first play is performed at the Festival of the Banner before an audience of the gods, a reenactment of the victory of good over evil, of Indra's defeat of the Ashuras. The Ashuras, you recall, arrived to object to the play, claiming that their portrayal in the play was offensive to them, rather a modern complaint, and paralyzing the speech, movements, and memory of the actors in reprisal. The reaction of the highest gods is noteworthy. Indra, furious, destroyed the evil spirits and said that his banner pole would henceforth be the symbol of the protection that must be afforded to actors and plays. Brahma asked the architect of heaven, Vishwakarma, to construct a safe space, a theater in which the performances could take place, and the gods themselves would guarantee to serve as the guardians of that space. And with this, Brahma's defense of the freedom of art, the theater was born. That is the true tradition of this country, and we would do well to abide by it. As Tagore asks us in his immortal poem, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out of the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake. Thank you.
Let me, before I open it up for questions to the floor, let me just take you up on the theme which you're talking about in terms of the country which you've admired so much, India, in terms of its tolerance. And you've described many examples of the way India is going in terms of being intolerant towards a lot of artists, whether in painting or in books. Why do you think this is happening? What is it, you know India well, what is it that is making India go down this path. And if I may add on top of that, is it this hijacking by the lunatic, fanatic fringe in society because they speak louder and go out on the streets and so forth, and a similar thing happening to radical Islam, meaning radical Islam, again, hijacking Islam in many ways and pulling it in a direction which is, again, leading to violence and so forth. What is this wellsprings of this?
Well, the growth of narrowly religious ideology in this country has been a phenomenon of the last couple of decades on both sides, and it seems as if one side tries to outdo the other. The rise of Hindutva, Hinduism, and the rise of the parallel rise of Islamic extremism is a sad fact, and it's not helped by what you mentioned earlier, which is a kind of vote bank politics. People playing to that gallery and privileging it. How to change it? I don't know the answer to that. It needs politicians to develop a backbone, that doesn't seem to be likely to happen anytime soon. And for the public and all arms of the public, such as the media, to stand up and say that enough's enough, that this is not the country in which we want to live. It's not what this country has been historically, and it's not what it should be.
But do you see a fundamental contradiction here, that here is a democratic country which in fact encourages freedom, and this very freedom is in fact used for intolerance?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's
how do you marry the two?
Yeah. Well, one of the great questions, I think, is what are the limits of freedom, and does one tolerate the intolerant? One of the great mistakes, of course, historically made in Europe was the toleration of the Nazi Party as it rose. The sense that it should be allowed to exist in a free society, and then, of course, when that party took power, it destroyed the system that brought it to power. So I think there is a limit to structural tolerance in a society, which is that you have to exclude from that tolerance those people who would destroy the society that tolerates it. There's a similar example in Algeria when the radical Islamist party of the FIS, the FIS, was allowed to stand in elections even though it did not agree to the secular principles which were supposed to be necessary to stand in elections. And then when it came to power, it immediately set about destroying the electoral system that had elected it. So these are big questions, the limits of tolerance, and I think we need to debate them in this country, because the levels of intolerance that now are allowed to exist under the umbrella of tolerance are in danger of destroying the tolerance that makes it possible for them to speak their mind. So, I mean, this is a profound philosophical question, and we're not going to answer it here, but we need to know that question is at the heart of the trouble.
In India, just to continue this a little bit, one would have expected that with on one side, the rise of Hindu fundamentalism, but also the fact that the right-wing parties actually came into power and actually ran governments. Normally what happens, like it happens for communists and leftists, that when they come into power, in fact, they move to the center, and they become more tolerant, and they blunt their extremism a bit. So that, on one side, that has happened in India, and that's a recent phenomenon. So why do you think that this has not blunted the edge of the fanatics?
Well, I suppose for the reason I said, that it's interesting that the argument has moved towards culture. It's very strange that such things as cultural artifacts should become what are most argued over. And it's because they're easy to target. These are weak targets. They're not, as I said, they don't have armies and defenders. And what happens, unfortunately, is that very often here, the people who are being targeted are blamed for being for being responsible for their own misfortune. So instead of, protecting people against a rioting mob, they get arrested. Their work gets seized. And this is a kind of upside down, an inversion of of correct behavior, which gives, of course, great energy to those people who would destroy these cultural artifacts, and it makes it likely that it'll happen more often, and so it happens more often. And again, this is not, it is happening a lot in India, and that's true, but it's not only in India. And there was a terrible case in England a couple of years ago when a young woman playwright, Sikh playwright, wrote a play about the Sikh community in England, which included a description of a sexual assault taking place inside a gurdwara in England. And the play was threatened, and the police and the government actually refused to protect the production, and it had to stop. And so here was a case of complete surrender to a very small group. It doesn't take many people. That's one of the tragedies of our age. It doesn't take very many people to create this kind of disruption. And in theory, that should mean it's very easy to stand up against them. Because if there's not that many of them, you should be able to deal with them. But every time you surrender to them, you multiply them. Next time, there's 10 times as many. Then you surrender to those, the next time, there's 10 times as many as that. So the surrender creates the increase of the problem.
Would you say that the British government acted well when the fatwa was issued against you, gave you protection, took it up against? A good example for a state standing up for one of its citizens.
The British government took the unoriginal position that if a foreign power is trying to execute one of their citizens, they should try and make sure it doesn't happen. And the fact that they did that to one of their citizens who wasn't even a supporter of a party then in power is a further example of the principled nature of that position. So yes, of course. I mean, it was. I'm very grateful for it. That was the way it happened, and it would be nice if other governments were to take the lead from that and to make sure that people being attacked by whatever level of threat, should be defended against it rather than blamed for it.